So we are extremely excited to have Corey Doctorow with us today. He is the author of the book that we've been working through these past 4 weeks. Corey Doctorow is a Locus Award-winning science fiction author, journalist, and special advisor to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He's also an activist working at the intersection of technology and human rights. And he's going to talk to us today about his book. So thank you so much for joining us, Corey.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored and excited to be here. It's just terrific. If I seem a little out of it, it's only because I was supposed to fly home from Las Vegas from the DEF CON conference yesterday, and all the flights were canceled because of a false alarm active shooter, which meant that I had to drive all night to get home to Los Angeles. So I'm a little loopy today, but
Oh,
I'm very excited to be here.
thank you so much for joining us. So we have a ton of questions for you. We're really excited about the book. We've been having very in-depth and thoughtful conversation around these topics for the past 3 weeks. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in with our questions for you. So first off, what was your initial motivation for the book?
Well, I think it was really, sort of stress management. I write when I'm anxious. It's a good way to distract myself, better than binge eating or whatever. And I wrote these in the early days of the Trump years. And it's only gotten more anxious times since, which is why I now have 8 books in production because things have been very intense for the last 2 or 3 years. So if you're gonna have some way of distracting yourself from stress and compartmentalizing it rather than dealing with it head on, at least finding something productive is I think a really useful thing to do.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually, your response to that kind of leads into one of the questions that we have from one of our participants, Spacco. If you would like to ask your question, I'm going to copy
I
and paste it
I
in.
know Spacco already. I know Spacco of old. He was a client at the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Okay, okay. So I am going to ask you to unmute Spock.
Is he with us yet? He might not be
Yeah,
with
there he
us.
is.
He is
Okay.
here. Mhm.
Oh, there he is. Got it.
It's so exciting to be here. And Corey, I see you on Twitter, and I'm so grateful that occasionally you will retweet one of my hilarious photos. So, but also I am thrilled about talking about this book because I read it pre-pandemic. And I had a couple of questions that I asked. I don't know which one. I'll do the first one, and I don't want to be the what do you call the graduate student question,
Right.
which is not really a question
It's
so much
a
as it is a
two-part question, and it's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I
So
had a follow-up comment, which is also more of a comment than a question. I know that one.
I just
exactly.
sent it to you, Spock, so you should have it in your messages.
So my question is, if you're going to write a similar story today, in year 3 of the pandemic, what would you incorporate into the story based on what you've learned from Americans' behavior, like
To
politically and socially, whatever? And the reason I want to ask that is because the things that I learned were more about, I thought the science would get me through it, but it turns out that beliefs of people ends up killing people. And so that's a big part of what I learned. And I would, what I'm thinking of doing differently in the future to, save America. What did you learn, and how is that
so which
how might that have changed your writing?
are you asking about a specific story or just overall of the 4 stories?
Oops, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, she was quick on that mute thing. I know how this is. The specific question for the last story about
Oh,
the
for Mask of the Red Death.
exactly.
Yeah. What would I change given what we know now? I mean, you could easily make it sort of zeitgeistier by just having some vax denial in there, and it would feel very contemporary. I mean, keeping in mind that Mask of the Red Death was not written about the pandemic, but rather about the idea of prepping and about the lack of and about the kind of incredible intense energy it takes to convince yourself that you can have a destiny separate from the destiny of the people around you, and that you owe them nothing, they owe you nothing. Society works best when we all pretend that we are completely disconnected from one another, and just go about our way sort of red in tooth and claw. And you're right that the pandemic and its weird beliefs has certainly engendered lots of interesting conspiratorial stuff. And I do have a kind of conspiratorial story on the back burner right now, that is about it's about think tanks endowed by billionaires to pursue weird dilettantish things that billionaires have convinced themselves of. AIs are going to take over the world, or we should replace all of our public education with charter schools, or like we have actual like examples of these in the wild. And it's about I have a colleague who in grad school had a job to like pay the bills working for a think tank called something like the Humility Institute, and it had been endowed by a billionaire, ultra rich, ultra trad Catholic who wanted to pay philosophers to convince atheists to doubt each other or doubt themselves. It's a very strange thing to have spent, like to have created a long permanent endowment for. And we were talking about this weird job he had, because it ultimately just turned into like a UBI for 16 philosophers, right? Who just like periodically would write a paper or whatever, but just didn't have to do anything. They just had this sinecure at the hands of it. And I realized that this is like the think tank version of the billionaire who leaves their house and all their fortune to their cat. And we've all seen these like old sort of Three Stooges bits where they're like called in to be carpenters in the house, where the cat owns the house and the butler is there to make sure that the cat is okay, and there's all this kind of natural comedy in where like the cat won't eat the caviar anymore, and the butler goes and pleads with the trustee of the billionaire's fund and says, please, can I just feed the cat some tuna fish? And the trustee says, under no circumstances, the will is very clear on this. And I was thinking, what would it be like if the cat was just a think tank to pursue some absolutely bizarre, completely unfounded conceit of some ultra wealthy, long dead person? And there were just a bunch of people in an increasingly degrading world of increased desperation who, by an unbelievable feat of luck, had landed in this sinecure where they had a very comfortable existence, provided that they diligently researched something completely pointless. And what would it be like to be sort of trapped inside that very comfortable bubble as things fell apart around you? It has a bit of a flavor of there's the I think it was the first Sherlock Holmes story, is a story called The Adventure of the Red-Headed League, and the premise is that there's a wealthy dead red-headed man who has endowed a service to hire and give jobs to red-headed men, and all they do is copy the London phone book, and for that they're paid a shilling a day, some handsome thing. And it's about a man who has been hired to do this job, and then he collected his pay and he went back to do his second day or his second week's work after doing this for a week every day. And the office had disappeared, and the people who'd hired him had disappeared. And Sherlock Holmes, can you tell me what the mystery is? And the mystery is that there was no redheaded billionaire. The Redheaded League doesn't exist. He was a clerk at a store that they wanted to tempt out so they could go and burrow in the store's basement and break into the vault of a bank down the road. And this whole thing was just a cheap way of luring him out of the store he worked in. But it was quite a fun story. But, like this idea of the rich dilettante with the strange endowment, it's a very old one, and so I really feel like you could work up a kind of great conspiratorial premise where it's just someone who's like, yeah, my job is to research the flat earth. I know there is no flat earth, but my job is to sit here and research the flat earth. There's 11 of us, everyone around us is starving and their lives are falling apart. We pay the rent of 10 of our family members, 10 extended family members each, and we go in every day and we pretend the earth is flat, and we beg the lawyer to let us do something else with this money, but we can't because it's an ironclad trust, and here we are. So that would be like a story in that vein based on the last 2 years of nonsense.
Interesting. Yeah. So, for Radicalized, how did you select the topics and also the key players in each story? For example, in Model Minority, why write from Clark's perspective as opposed to Bruce's, for example?
Yeah. So each of those stories came about separately. I didn't choose them as an anthology. I wrote each of them in kind of a fury and sent them to my editor at Tor. And I sent him the first one. I sent him Unauthorized Bread, and he said, "Oh, this is great. We were just thinking about doing these quick turnaround novella standalones, tiny little skinny books of, 60 pages. We're just going to publish this and we'll pay you for it. And we'll publish it straight away 6 weeks from now." And then, like, a week later, I sent him the next one. And he was like, "Oh, we'll do two of them." And then I sent him the third one. He's like, "Are you going to keep doing this? Because maybe we should just do a book." And so that's how I ended up with the book of the four of them. Um, the Each of them had its own sort of proximate stimulus, right? So Unauthorized Bread was really just kind of the latest iteration of a series of thought experiments and stories and advocacy and regulatory briefs and court arguments and testimony that I've given about the dangers of building systems that are designed to control their users, and about how the important thing about a computer is not so much what it does, but who it does it for and who it does it to. And this has really been a project I've worked on now for 20 years. And I had, at one point, I was writing a column for The Guardian, and a lot of people who had historically been on my side on this fight had bought iPhones and had said, "Well, normally I believe that people should have the right to decide how their device works, but Steve Jobs has made such an elegant device. Surely he will only make good choices for us, and no one needs to have the power to override Steve Jobs' choice. If you don't like it, just don't buy the phone." And I wrote a little thought experiment column called "If Dishwashers Were iPhones," and it was a letter from the kind of Steve Jobsian CEO of a next generation dishwasher company, explaining why putting your grandmother's china or the dishes you bought down at the Kmart was a form of piracy, and how they designed this dishwasher to work specifically with their dishes and their partner's dishes, and you're a bad person if you choose other dishes. And besides that, do you know that foodborne illnesses have killed more people than any other cause of death in human history? How can we get your dishes clean if you're just like freeballing it with your own dishes? And I wrote this, and the comments were just full of people saying, "Oh, you're a hipster who hates Apple," and no one engaging with it. So I was just like, I'm going to stand up again and take my lumps again. I'm going to do another set of appliance stories. Um, the Superman story, the first impulse for this came about when I was reading Matt Taibbi's book, "I Can't Breathe," his history of the execution of a black man on Staten Island by Staten Island police, who had a long history of beating and even killing other black men. And he writes about it very well, and he speaks to a lot of the eyewitnesses who were there because it happened in broad daylight. And he as I was reading this, I just kept having this fundamentally infantile fantasy that I just wished a superhero would step in and just interpose himself between the bad guys and the good guys. And I got to thinking about Superman, and I have a weird long relationship with Superman. I have written a bunch of unauthorized Superman stories at various times in my career. And Superman came from Toronto, like me. The Daily Planet was the Toronto Star. I was created by two Jewish refugee kids. My dad was a Jewish refugee kid from Russia. My parents lived on Joe Shuster Way. And one of the things I really wanted to dig into was the contingency of whiteness, and how, like, whiteness is a category that can be given and withdrawn, and how once you are given whiteness, it's very hard to not throw your lot in with whiteness as hard as you can, because you're very, very aware that it can be taken away. And so, I think here about my relatives who are absolutely unwilling to countenance the possibility that it is unjust to maintain a concentration camps in Palestine, and how the Israel cannot possibly have done anything wrong, and how the people they've aligned themselves with on the American religious right are all anti-Semites, but they are still Israel hawks, right? And so they're willing to sort of throw themselves in with these anti-Semites, these deranged religious people who believe that moving the temple to Jerusalem will bring about the rapture and the second coming of Christ, and who at the same time are virulent racists and anti-Semites, and how, at the moment where you have Civil War cosplayers marching through the streets of Charlottesville chanting "Jews will not replace us," you realize that you may be caping for them, but they're not going to cape for you, right? As far as they're concerned, you're just a useful idiot. The last person who gets to climb over the gunnels into the whiteness boat is going to be the first one they throw overboard when the chance comes. And so I wanted to think about what it meant for Superman, who is not even a man, let alone human, right, to have allied himself with the power structures of America, and what would happen the minute Superman stopped being a model minority, right? Stop being the kind of good immigrant who can support the American project wholeheartedly, and who starts to question it. I could do this for all four of the stories, but it would take a long time. But that's sort of the direction I went in. The Mask of the Red Death was really just about what is now obvious nonsense of the prepper fantasy, right? That we don't have a shared microbial destiny. We really now understand it. I think in 2019 it was a lot less widely understood, and even though we understand it intellectually, we haven't absorbed it on a policy level, right? Like, here we are thinking that we can treat monkeypox as a national bordered phenomenon as opposed to something that's global. I used to work at the World Intellectual Property Organization for an NGO, among other things, on the Access to Medicines Treaty. And I was there when the Gates Foundation was saying that there should not be a waiver for AIDS drugs in South Africa and in Brazil. And I'm very familiar with how the pharmaceutical industry and the people who stand for it are completely willing to jettison any idea of like our survival as a species in order to preserve the right of these very large corporations to have effectively unbounded profit.
Thank you for sharing that. Jamel has a question. Did you want to ask Jamel, or would you like me to ask it?
I'll ask it. So when we read Model Minority, we saw that the superhero that you created, you just said, you just wished a superhero could come in and kind of fix this. And he had superpowers. He could see through walls. He could hear conversations that couldn't be heard. And yet, even with that, it wasn't enough. I mean, as you went through the exercise and you created the character, was that your thinking? Was that there is no panacea. There's no one super thing that can clean this up.
Well, that is Superman's origin story, right? You have Schuster and Siegel cowering in New York, watching their family members and loved ones across the ocean in Europe being herded into death camps, and people sitting idly by, America refusing to get involved in the war. And they wished for a golem, right? The story of the golem is the story of the rabbi who builds a giant Superman out of clay to defend the village from the pogroms. And of course, the thing that ultimately defeated fascism was not a superhero, right? It was the single largest collective action project in the history of the world, right? It was a multinational alliance, mostly of working people who threw their body into a meat grinder and who also oriented all labor and production all around the world in order to fight back fascism and totalitarianism. It was the opposite of an individual project. If it had just been an individual project, if it had just been, it's Inglorious Bastards, right? 6 people against the war, we would be living in a satellite of the Third Reich today, right? It was the collective action that resolved the horrors of fascism.
Yeah, that is a perfect segue into our next question. A common theme in your stories is community, whether for better or for worse. So talk about the importance of community and your vision of community in an equitable society.
Sure. Well, so the University of Chicago School, you guys are probably familiar with them. They're kind of the architects of all of our misery. They like invented neoliberalism, but they had a guy there who was not wrong about everything. There's a guy called Ronald Coase, uh, who wrote a paper called The Theory of the Firm, won a Nobel Prize in economics for it. And I should note here that the Nobel Prize in economics is not a real Nobel Prize, that economists felt sad because no one took them seriously as scientists, so they got someone else called Nobel to sponsor a prize. It's not really like it's not a Nobel Prize. But anyway, Coase won the Nobel Prize for this thing called the theory of the firm. And the thing that Coase is asking is like, why do we have groups? What is the point of a group of any kind? A community, a company, the mafia, the Catholic Church, the US government, a Rotary Club, building bridges. Why do we make groups, right? And he says it's because whenever you want to do something that is superhuman, which is to say more than one person can do, that's literally all superhuman means, right? More than one person can do. You need to make sure that you're not working across purposes, right? If we're going to knit a sweater together, we have to make sure that I'm not unknitting the part that you're knitting, right? Otherwise, we're going to get into a lot of trouble. And so we're going to have a meeting and a plan, right? And we're going to have to figure out like how to decide who's doing what, how to check to make sure that we're all doing it, and all of the rest of it. And he says the reason we build an organization, doesn't matter what kind, is to reduce the amount of time we spend in meetings so we can maximize the amount of time we spend doing the thing that we're having a meeting about. Right? That's my gloss on his theory there, but that's what it comes down to. So if you want to be superhuman, right, if you want to do more than what other humans can do, you need to build institutions, right? And institutions are always communities. Sometimes they're not very nice communities, right? Sometimes they're super top-down command and control communities. Sometimes they're very egalitarian. Sometimes they're dysfunctional. Sometimes the real treasure we found were the friends we made along the way, and the community doesn't get much done, but it's still a lot of fun to go and have your wine and painting club every week, even if you never do any painting and just end up drinking wine. It's all of those are examples of how we create communities and why we create communities. What a community is for, right, is to get stuff done. And for me, the thing about organizations and institutions is that the more communication you have to do, right, the more complicated the project is, historically, the less autonomy each part of the group has been allowed to have. If you think about contrasting the way that an artisan works versus the way an industrial worker works, the artisan who's making a door says, oh, it's a nice crisp autumn day outside. I'll take the door outside and today I'll paint, right? But when it rains, they go inside and they plane or they sand or something else, and that's fine. Now the worker on the assembly line, if it's a nice autumn day and they say, I'm going to stand up from my posture here on the assembly line, leave my station and go outside and, jump in the piles of leaves, the assembly line breaks down. Now the assembly line is good for other reasons, right? The assembly line is good because like it created material abundance, right? Efficient industrial production took us from a world in which we had very little and struggled to a world where we could all have enough. But it did so at the cost of our autonomy. And the industrial structure is extremely hierarchical, right? It's all, it reaches its apotheosis in what are called the time and motion studies, which were people like the guy who wrote Cheaper by the Dozen, Frank Gilbreth, and Taylor, and so on, who were these semi-charlatans who would come into the factory in a white coat with a clipboard, and they would watch you work, and they would say, I know you think you know how to screw that widget onto that other assembly, but you're doing it wrong. If you held your elbow like this, you would be more efficient. And usually they just had no idea what they were talking about. It was like purely aesthetic. It was just like the workers looked better, and so the bosses who paid them were like, my workers look so efficient. My consultant must have done good work for me. And it was, at the real cost of autonomy. It was very humiliating and often very dangerous for the workers who did it. And what digital networks have done is they've created an improvisational, fluid style to our organizational structures that allows us to do things that are big and ambitious, right? Like write the greatest encyclopedia in the history of the world, or create the most robust operating system ever made. And to do it with the kind of top-down command structure that you might find in like an ambitious bake sale, instead of the kind of top-down command structure you used to find at, say, IBM or even the Encyclopedia Britannica. And so what I think when I think about communities in the future in a technologically enabled world is the possibility that we could take the fluid, improvisational, autonomous, humanity respecting, individual dignity respecting way of working that was characteristic of pre-industrial labor, even among serfs, even among feudal serfs who might only see the lord once a month when they went to pay the rent, and who would otherwise be entirely at their own devices, right? And that we might apply that to the kind of advanced, humanity uplifting, wonderful, life-changing projects. I wrote a novel called Walk Away, whose kind of instigating premise was, what if we could build high rises or space programs the way we make open source software, or the way we write Wikipedia? Messy, right? Messy. Sometimes there's a lot of complaining. Hell is other people. There'd be trolls. There'd be people who thought you were doing it wrong. You'd have to convince people instead of giving them orders. But you could also do it your way. And that mixture of interdependency and community, and the recognition of the duty you owe to other people and the duty that other people owe to you, without fetishizing obedience or structure for its own sake, as much structure as is needed and not one bit more. And with the amount of structure we need going down monotonically as our communications tools get better, so that all work becomes play, that for me is the ideal. And I've got a novel coming out in 2024 called The Lost Cause, that's about truth and reconciliation with white nationalist militias after a Green New Deal transition that actually has us confronting the climate emergency. That's really about kind of the stage that takes us there.
Thank you for that. A lot to think about and reflect on. We have a question from Jan. So Jan, if you're okay with asking your question, I'll ask you to unmute. Otherwise, we can read your question for you.
Sure. It's nice to meet you, Corey. I'm a retired school librarian, and for several years, I would use your novel Little Brother with my junior high school students, and it always found this very enthusiastic audience of teens who thought, they could save the world too, right? And fight, the evil. And I'm wondering, in this terrible atmosphere that we're in right now, if you've experienced the challenges of the book banners and everybody against your novels. Because I'm looking back, I think so many books like Little Brother that I used with my students would probably be, have parents all objected to. So I'm wondering if you've experienced this and what you recommend for us and how we should, respond to these challenges in our communities and what we should be doing.
Well, first of all, thank you for being a school librarian. I'm a recovering library worker. I'm a visiting professor at the library school at UNC, and I worked with librarians at WIPO, the International Federation of Library Associations, and their electronic book equivalent, which is EIFL, which I can Electronic Information Federation of Libraries or something. I forget. International. electronic publishing and internet. I can't remember. Anyway, thank you for all of that. I have not been caught in the current wave of book bans, but I did get caught in a kind of early one, right? So like if you think about this, the broods of cicadas, where like cicada 17 all hatches on the 17th year, but actually it's not true. There are like 3% of them will hatch in the 16th year, and like 2% in the 15th, and like 5 will hatch 2 years in and just get lonely and die. So I was like really early. I was one of those weird early brood cicadas. Little Brother had been picked as the one book, one school summer read for a school in Pensacola, Florida called Booker T. Washington High. And the principal, who had not read the book, read some reviews of the book and thought that he might get parent complaints. Didn't actually get any parent complaints. And he canceled the entire summer reading program to prevent this. So that was really something. And that it was Booker T. Washington High was really just like icing on the cake. You can't make this up. If you put it in a novel, they'd say, oh, it's a bit on the nose, isn't it? Right? So what do we do then? So I had some real concerns because it's a right to work state. And the teacher was not unionized. I didn't want to get her fired. My folks are both public school teachers and pedagogists. They now oversee doctoral candidates in education in Florida randomly. They do it remotely, but at Nova Southeastern in Lauderdale. And having grown up with school teachers, I did not want to see a good teacher fired for recommending my work. So I took my cues from her. And she, I think, took her cues from the kids. But I did not want to plunge her into trouble. I went to the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund as my first port of call, because CBLDF was founded specifically around moral panics about kids reading stuff. Because if you think about the origin of the moral panic about kids and reading, actually before it was comics, it was young women reading novels. So novels, period, were considered originally to be smut that would distract young women from their duties to grow up to be demure wives. But the second moral panic about books came about when a fraudster named Frederick Wortham wrote a book called The Seduction of the Innocents, where he presented a bunch of false research that was not grounded in anything he'd done. He made it up about comic books driving children nuts and turning them into gangsters who had fights with zip guns and smoked marijuana. And on the strength of this, they created the comic book code, the little A that we've all seen on the covers of our comics. And it became open season on comic store owners who carried anything that didn't have that little A, which was a self-certification system dreamed up by a cartel of the major comics publishers. And they went after them. They went after them for, selling smut to children, even if there was no child involved. If you had a comic book that had any adult themes in it, it was considered to be, because it was in a comic store, which was a children's store, oftentimes you get vice raids just on those. So Comic Book Legal Defense Fund was founded to deal with this, and they really understood how to do it. And they mobilized the American Coalition Against Censorship, and they were very good about offering advice to this teacher. And they also worked with the NCT, the National Coalition of Teachers of English, who stepped in. So we had a lot. So that's lesson 2. So lesson 1 is take your lead from the people who have the most to lose, so that you don't endanger them for your stunt. And lesson 2 was to enlist institutions who fight these fights. And from there, we just got into some creative stuff. My publisher sent 200 copies of the book to distribute. There's a company, they're really fun. I don't think that they ever really took off as much as they hoped they would, but there's a company called Litographs, Litographs, like lithograph without the initial H. And Litographs does essentially typewriter paintings of the entire text of books. So they have laid out the entire text of Little Brother in typewriter art that makes a picture of a kid with a lumberjack's axe chopping down a utility pole with a CCTV camera on the top of it. And if you have a magnifying glass, you can read the whole book. So we sent them 2 framed copies of this to hang in the school library. So it was right there. I recorded a message for the students and put it online. I corresponded with the students through the summer. And then I cryptographically signed text files of the book and mailed them to students with instructions about how to verify the cryptographic signature. So this was like NFTs without the bad stuff. and I've heard from some of those students since, and it did well. And I did go and speak to the AP class in the school library the next year, and the teacher kept her job. NCT stepped in and showed that as is happening today, the principal had not followed the school's procedure for challenging books. There was a procedure. And of course, the procedure wasn't, let's cancel the entire summer reading program, right? Strangely enough, no one sat down and wrote, the appropriate thing to do if you think a book might be inappropriate is to cancel an entire reading program and not tell anyone why, right? So, there was that. And, but what didn't happen and what would have happened and what the teacher lamented, and we've had conversations about it since, the teacher librarian, is that the school had a high cohort of low income, racialized students who were not in the AP English class and had been streamed into basic classes, did not have a lot of literature in their lives. And she'd specifically chosen this book because she thought it would engage them, and they didn't get engaged by it. So the principal won. Those kids did not read that book as much as we tried, and we tried a lot. But we did get a lot of other kids elsewhere in the country interested in reading the book because the publicity itself, because these stunts, and they were stunts, mailing the books and sending the poster and so on. They were stunts, right? But they were stunts in service of evoking what's called the Streisand effect, which is a term coined by my friend Mike Masnick. So there's an aerial survey of the California coastline where they fly a small plane over the coast and they look at erosion. And they do it every couple of years, or maybe it's even every couple of months. And they just fly over and take pictures. And they're in a public records repository, so you can watch erosion on the California coast. And of course, they get the roofs of all the mansions in the California coast, including Barbra Streisand's. And Barbra Streisand went bananas about this and made an enormous stink to try and get these public records taken offline. And before she made the stink, the photo of her roof had been accessed 3 times. After she made the stink, it had been accessed 180,000 times. And so that is the Streisand effect, right? Where you try to discourage people from engaging in censorship by using the act of censorship as a mechanism for bringing attention to the thing they're seeking to suppress. And we definitely managed that, even if those kids lost out, which I still regret.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Any type of censorship is incredibly disheartening, especially for marginalized groups who already have limited access to reading materials and sharing ideas. Yep.
I think that's right. I mean, this is why I am very worried about calls to make Facebook, quote, better at moderation, because I think the right answer is to devolve control of moderation to communities at the periphery. Because if we say to Facebook, you have a duty to police odious content, they will make lots of mistakes, and they'll make the most mistakes among communities that don't get to speak up, because those are the people who can't make them improve their procedures. And so over the long run, you have a lot of pressure to fix the moderation errors that take place, the routine moderation errors that take place among people who are sort of high status and who have a big microphone, and very little for the other people. And, the worst cases we already see right now is you create laws like Sesta Fosta to protect victims of sex trafficking, and it is used to stop sex workers from keeping themselves safe and having communities where they can talk about safety and who's a bad client and so on. Or, the other one that comes up all the time is that moderation policies, especially filters, but often human moderators, can't tell the difference between a community in which people are using racial slurs to victimize people who are racialized, and a community in which people who have been victimized by racial slurs gather to say, can you believe he called me this horrible name? And moderators are like, well, all of you are now kicked off the platform, and so, yeah, I think there is a real concern now among people who have correctly understood that Mark Zuckerberg is uniquely unsuited to having unilateral control over the online lives of 3 billion people, but whose answer to that is we should find someone who's better at having that job. And I think the right answer is we should abolish that job. That job just shouldn't exist.
Yeah, what you're saying makes me think of a line in Radicalized where the ACLU lawyer comes and speaks to Joe, and he says that your case can either help us to make sure that good law is written or make sure to prevent bad law from being written. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So Wes has a question, so I'm going to ask him to unmute.
Well, appreciate your family being educators. I'm an educator. Jan, shout out for your work as well. I'm wearing a shirt that says America needs teachers, but we really just need pay and we need support. That's the real thing. But my question focuses, we asked this question last week when reading the novella Radicalized. And so we asked, fear is often used as a political weapon to motivate constituent behavior. Is it an effective tool, in your opinion? And is it one that should be employed by progressives? Why or why not?
Well, there's that line I stole from The Onion in that story, right? Violence never solved anything so long as you ignore all of human history, right? Struggle has always involved eventually people putting their body in harm's way. I can't think of a single struggle, even the most nonviolent ones. In fact, the most nonviolent ones are the ones where people put their bodies in the most harm's way because they took a vow not to protect themselves, either tactically or philosophically, from the violence. And I grew up in the nuclear non-proliferation movement, and I grew up in the peaceful protest movement, and got dragged away from sit-ins and arrested, and I've never been in a fight in my life, but the thing I thought about when I wrote that story, the thing that got me thinking about writing that story is when I became a parent. I've got a 14-year-old, and when I became a parent, I lost my ability to read fiction in which the motivating premise for the narrator or the characters is that something horrible has happened to a child. It just lost me. I could no longer read those stories. I just couldn't lose myself in them. They would be I got hung up on it. And I have felt this kind of existential, overwhelming, furious feeling at the thought of my child being in danger or someone harming my child. And I thought, you have a country full of heavily armed white men whose grievances are so petty and drive them to horrific acts of violence, right? Road rage, who nevertheless sit meekly by while the people they love the most are doomed to die horrible deaths by insurance executives whose home addresses are not that hard to find. And, I'm not saying that they should go and kill those insurance executives. I'm just saying, how is it that they're not going and killing those insurance executives, right? I'm a person of peace. I am a nonviolent protest person. I am, to be very clear, this is not a suggestion, but it is a really interesting question. And when you start tugging on that thread and thinking about all the people who don't live in fear, right? Speaking as the father of a kid who goes through lockdown drills, right? All the people who don't live in fear, and who, it is weird to think that they don't live in fear, given who they are and what they do and the consequences of the selfish choices they make on their own behalf and on behalf of their shareholders. And so that's how that story came about. And, a place where this is playing out right now in the debate about literature is in the discussion of a very good book that came out around the same time as Radicalized, a year later, called the Ministry for the Future by my friend Kim Stanley Robinson. And Stan had written a series of novels set after climate transition, and he'd written a series of novels that were set in a climate emergency, but he had never written a novel in which the climate emergency becomes a climate transition. And that's what Ministry for the Future is. And it's a wonderful book. Without spoiling it too much, I hope, the transition involves spectacular acts of terrorist violence after the climate emergency reaches a kind of fever pitch. The book opens in the first 10 pages of the book. There is a heat wave in India that kills 40 million people, and it's described very viscerally. And Stan, in this book, has the transition take place in part directly because of spectacular acts of violence. And it changes the politics. Direct action changes the politics. And the book itself is written in this kind of documentary style. It's made up of these little vignettes where you're in a different character's point of view for just, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, all around the edges. So you get to see the whole thing in the round, but you never see the terrorists and you never see their victims. And in my review of the book, I said, this feels like Stan